Between all of the PlayStation 5 Pro upgrades we've tested to date, the Resident Evil series enjoys some of the greatest benefits by running on Sony's new hardware. In order, we have 2017's Resident Evil 7, the remakes for RE2 and 3, Resident Evil Village, and most recently, Resident Evil 4 Remake. Capcom's in-house RE engine forms the technical backbone for all 5 games, of course, and each one runs as a native PS5 app. Except there's often a catch to their performance delivery on base PS5 in some aspect or another. Whether it's using ray tracing features at 60 frames per second in some cases, or enabling the 120Hz high frame rate mode in others, there's potential not being totally fulfilled on base hardware. At times, it falls far short of those targets, depending on the game. Today then, PS5 Pro offers a solution across the board, with its plus 45% increase in GPU power and the offering of PSSR upscaling to assist matters in one specific case. There is now a genuine means to bridge the gap to those frame rate targets. So, has the situation changed? Does PS5 Pro make ray tracing at 60 frames per second possible in every Resident Evil title? Also, is a stable 120 FPS now viable in each game? Let's find out. Before we get to that, the basic facts first. Out of all 5 games, only the 2 latest series entries, Resident Evil 4 Remake and Resident Evil Village, are actually updated with Pro support. The other 3 games still receive a performance boost on PS5 Pro, of course, inherent in running from its faster GPU, but the features and visual settings remain the same as the base machine. For RE4 Remake and Village, the PlayStation Store pages show a PS5 Pro enhanced symbol, but actually not much detail on what's actually changed. Booting each game up though, one addition sticks out immediately. PS5 Pro users now get a 120Hz high frame rate toggle, which isn't included on base PS5. Essentially, this works much like the 120Hz toggles already present in Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes, and 7 as well. But it's very much a Pro exclusive feature for the latest 2 games. Let's kick off with Resident Evil Village. Image comparisons matter more so here, with Capcom seemingly using Village as a means to experiment with PSSR. All core visual settings stay in place from base PS5, so the key difference is in its native resolution and the upscaler of choice. PS5 Pro runs at a fixed 1536 by 864 resolution, which is then reconstructed to 4K using PSSR. This setup applies to every mode I've tested in Village, whether that's ray tracing on or off, or even the 120Hz high frame rate mode. The result is respectable overall, though there is a trade-off when compared to the 4K checkerboarding used on base PS5, in that case rendering at a native 1920 by 2160. During motion, for example, there is less visual noise using the PSSR method on Pro, notably on swaying branches and grass. The base PS5 checkerboard method is sharper, crisper, but then also more artifact prone on these points. Stippling artifacts and pixelation at times line the edges of an object in motion on the base console, which isn't as evident in motion using PSSR. The trade-off, however, is that the PSSR approach also softens elements in motion, especially fine detail like swaying grass, while it also muddies the definition of hair elements in movement too. It's fortunately not so evident when played at regular speed, and certainly not without a serious zoom in. Still, it is a step back in several comparison shots in sharpness at times next to the base PS5. On the plus side, more static fixed camera shots on PS5 Pro do ultimately settle on a comparably crisp 4K image owing to a build-up of information from previous frames. Also, in some side-by-sides, you'd be hard-pressed to notice the difference. The 864p base pixel count typically reveals itself on new data within the frame, like as doors swing open or at the screen's edges during a camera whip pan. Besides these issues then, PSSR holds up in most other scenarios. It's not perfect, and the reconstruction of elements like distant branches and hair can at times be a step back, though at least it avoids the more distracting flickering on shadowed areas found in the likes of, say, Dragon's Dogma 2, another RE Engine title. Jumping over to framerate testing, running Resident Evil Village with ray tracing engaged is a much more robust 60fps experience on PS5 Pro. We get RT reflections, ambient occlusion, and a form of global illumination here, improving the game's shadows and local bounce lighting for interiors. Looking at base PS5's delivery with this RT mode though, it generally holds well at 60 frames per second. Certainly, with a VRR supporting display, it's very passable across most of its exteriors, with only occasional passages of play dipping into the 50s. However, exceptional points like this late reservoir boss battle, set across a huge body of water with RT reflections, drag us into the mid-40s at times on base PS5. Again, it's not a calamity on a VRR display, but for those without that feature, it's much too variable, and hence, for the base console, running this area with RT disabled is a better route to locking at 60fps. By comparison though, it's clear that this ray tracing mode's 60fps line is tidied up beautifully on PS5 Pro. Syncing each test in a side-by-side manner, especially this reservoir boss, we're almost perfectly getting to 60fps. I say almost because PS5 Pro does drop while using a rocket launcher against this destructible building, taking us to 55fps for a spell. But accepting that as an absolute extreme stress point, it's otherwise a success. Next up, there's the prospect of playing Village at 120 frames per second via PS5 Pro's new high frame rate mode. The good news is, it's almost flawless in hitting the target, with the inevitable catch being that ray tracing must be sacrificed to get there. Curiously, Resident Evil Village lets us run this RT mode at 120Hz, unlike earlier entries in the series where it's either one or the other, and it yields expectedly middling results at between 55 to 90fps in typical play. It's not a realistic target, and instead we have a perfectly decent non-RT option that genuinely hits and holds 120fps in every scenario. Each chapter I've tested so far on PS5 Pro, and even including the reservoir set piece, runs without missing a beat. As such, it's one of the more successful uses of Pro hardware, and it does make me wonder. It begs the question as to how the base PS5 might run with a similar 120Hz option. Alas, without this mode on both consoles, we're not able to run a benchmark style test to show the Pro advantage here. Still, it's a superb turnout. Moving on, Resident Evil 4 Remake is more impressive in its performance gains on PS5 Pro, though it's also a more taxing title overall. In terms of visual comparisons, there's also not much change compared to base PS5. There's no PSSR upscaling in place this time around, and rather we continue to use the checkerboard rendering of the base PS5. So this means the resolution mode still runs at 2160p, while the framerate mode runs at 1944p. Below this mode selection, we keep a toggle for ray tracing, adding RT reflections in this case, and at the menu's foot, there's also the hair strand option. Finally, PS5 Pro gets a 120Hz high frame rate mode here, of course, much like Village. Looking back at the base PS5, running the game on the resolution mode with ray tracing enabled proved a recipe for disaster. Between the cutscenes and the third-person combat, it operates in the 40 to 60fps range. A solution for base PS5 users, at least, is to swap to the performance mode, which runs at between 55 to 60fps with that RT mode in place as well. For the most optimal 60fps experience though, you'd really have to abandon that RT mode altogether. Adding PS5 Pro into the mix, the potential for improvement is truly tapped into here, especially using its resolution mode while engaging ray tracing. Compared to base PS5, every single route, the woodland opener, the battle around the burning village, locks us to 60fps convincingly this time. Only one close-up of Leon during a cutscene triggers any sort of drop, taking us to 55fps, but this is a real outlier for PS5 Pro. The relative margin of improvement is represented here as a percentage in our test, with around a plus 30% gain in matching cutscenes, at times rising to 40%. Given that RE4 Remake is the very latest, and among the most taxing of Capcom's RE engine efforts, it's a big win for series fans looking for a smooth way to play on console. Perhaps the only complaint is that there's no real push to go the extra mile in visual features. It's really a conservative use of Pro hardware in this sense, but one that at least addresses the main issue with its base PS5 performance. What about the 120Hz mode on PS5 Pro? There's no comparison to the base PS5 model, of course, it being a Pro exclusive mode. Still, it's clear that Resident Evil 4 Remake is a much more challenging case than Village in pushing to 120 FPS. For perspective, I've actually put PS5 Pro on both sides of this comparison to show the extremes, the absolute best and worst case. On the left, we have the performance mode with ray tracing disabled, and on the right, it's the works. Resolution mode, RT engaged, and hair strand physics too. The truth though is that neither approach really gets us to a locked 120 in outdoors gameplay. The performance mode wavers between 85 to 105 FPS during combat, while the resolution mode is at a lesser 70 to 90 FPS. Surprisingly, interior areas and also cutscenes at times do actually lock at 120 FPS on the performance mode. It is possible for stretches, just not as often as you might hope. As a new option for Pro users then, the high frame rate mode is a benefit for tighter input response, especially paired with the performance mode. But, unlike Village, it does need a VR display in this case to address the wavering frame rate. Rounding out, let's look back at the other three RE Engine releases, Resident Evil 7 and the remakes for Resident Evil 2 and 3. None of these games have an official PS5 Pro upgrade as of publishing this analysis, but they still show benefits using Sony's new machine. All feature a ray tracing toggle, but sadly 2 and 3 Remake in particular run very poorly on base PS5 while using it. Readings bounce in the 35 to 60 FPS no man's land, and ultimately a locked 60 is only achieved by switching ray tracing off entirely. Neither Remake is well optimized for ray tracing on base PS5, and yet leaving the frame rate unlocked to 60 at least pays dividends today with a more capable console in hand. For Resident Evil 2 Remake, for example, every single point around the Raccoon Police Department now hits 60 frames per second on PS5 Pro. The petrol station, the zombie-infested streets with RT reflections in view all tick along smoothly. Exceptions are possible of course, and an early zombie encounter pushes Pro down to 48 FPS for a stretch, but as far as gameplay is concerned, it's a much needed improvement. In the best case, Pro hardware peaks at a plus 45% gain in FPS over base hardware, while Resident Evil 3 Remake shows a similar margin of improvement. Even without a PS5 Pro upgrade then, there's a great satisfaction in seeing 2 and 3 Remake run at a tighter 60 FPS lock with ray tracing. Visual settings are unchanged in these cases, but the new hardware capabilities are seemingly pitched just right for this mode to work. As for Resident Evil 7, the game that debuted the RE Engine back in 2017, there's a less exciting margin to speak on. Looking back, it always ran at a locked 60 FPS on base PS5, and so it follows on the Pro model as well. Interestingly, there's a 120Hz option already baked into the PS5 code for these three games, no Pro patch needed. So long as ray tracing is disabled, it engages to give us an unlocked 120 FPS reading. Once again, there's no real advantage playing Resident Evil 7 on Pro hardware, given it already ran at a mostly stable line on the base console. The two Remake projects are a different story though, and demonstrate a colossal Pro frame rate boost that at last locks us to 120 FPS. Where previously base PS5 fluctuated between 90 to 120 FPS, with RT disabled of course, PS5 Pro flattens the line out almost completely in both games. Looking across all 5 Resident Evil games, PS5 Pro turns around almost every instance where the base model failed to hit 60 frames per second with ray tracing. The good news is that this is now a viable performant combination. And likewise, 120 FPS works uniformly well on each game, with the exception of Resident Evil 4 Remake. It perhaps speaks to a lack of optimization for those ray tracing options on base PS5 in the first place, especially for Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes. A 30 FPS cap might have made more sense in those cases. Still, the silver lining is that Capcom's use of an unlocked frame rate back then translates to a stable 60 FPS on Pro hardware today. The only outstanding criticism is that there's limited ambition beyond those frame rate boosts. Outside of the move to PSSR in Resident Evil Village, we're being served a matching visual feature set to base PS5. At the very least, PS5 Pro addresses the performance issues the series has been faced with for all these years, and for that alone, the upgrade we're seeing across the Resident Evil series ranks as one of its greatest successes. But that's all from me today. If you did find this video useful or insightful in any way, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video and many more, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.